This is Mining Ruby, a study on the programming language Ruby. This is done by Melissa Griffin for the class COP 4020. The things we're going to look at today are the introduction, the history of Ruby, general syntax of Ruby, Ruby on Rails, and the conclusion. The introduction. The investigation methods that I used to research the programming language Ruby were the Google search engine and also the FSU online library. The main sources that I ended up using were rubylang.org, which is the official website of Ruby, rubydoc.org, which is a documentation website of Ruby that is supported by the official website, and then rubyonrails.org, which is the official website for Ruby on Rails. The history of Ruby. Ruby was created in 1993 by Yukihiro Matsumoto. He goes by Mats. It was first released in 1995 in Japanese. The first English book did not come around until 2001. The way that Mats spread Ruby around to English-speaking users and some other users was through the RubyTalk mailing list. This mailing list, he sent out English versions of syntax of Ruby and support for Ruby, and would answer questions that developers would send him through the mailing list. When Mats set out to create Ruby, he wanted a language more powerful than Perl and more meaningful than Python. What he ended up with, and honestly what he was going for, was a truly object-oriented language that had simple syntax and was easy for people to use. One of the things that has come about from Ruby is a large community of developers. The community is very much a community. It's very supportive and very helpful. One of their mottos is MiniSwan, and this stands for Mats is nice, so we are nice. What this translates to basically is that when a new person comes into the Ruby community, they are treated well instead of being treated as if they are ignorant because they do not understand something. Ruby gained popularity in the 2000s after the English book was released, and it just got more traction in English-speaking places, but it lost some around 2012. This graphic over here is the rank of top languages on github.com over time. And you can see this top line right here is the line that represents Ruby repositories on GitHub. And this graphic actually represents both private repositories and public repositories. So right here around 2012 is where Ruby started to lose some popularity. One of the explanations for why Ruby was so popular initially is that in 2008, Ruby on Rails put all of their code onto GitHub, which, like I said, would explain why it was so high right here. Now, even though the popularity has decreased, it is still a very high language on GitHub. It's actually number 3, and these numbers were pulled from GitHub themselves. So even though this is just one source, GitHub does represent a lot of repositories, so I think it's safe to say that Ruby, even though it has lost some popularity, is still very popular. The general syntax of Ruby. As I stated earlier, Mats, when he was designing Ruby, he really wanted a clean, simple, object-oriented language. So Ruby really does have clean syntax. It does not require semicolons at the end of a line. Now, if you have multi-line statements, obviously you have to put a comma in between the separate lines to show that they go together. But you can also put 2 separate statements onto one line, and you separate those by a semicolon. The way that a method is defined is using definite pairs of tags, and the comments are just behind a pound symbol. Everything in Ruby is an object. Part of this is attributed to the fact that Ruby has strong dynamic typing. You can see here some code to find the absolute value in Java. As you can see, you have to use the math class and call the math class's absolute value method with mynum as a parameter to get the absolute value. In Ruby, to find the absolute value, if mynum is a double or an integer or any default number type, all you have to do is mynum.abs and you will get the absolute value. Now, since Ruby has dynamic typing, this will also work if you have mynum is equal to 2.abs. The 2 is dynamically typed as an integer, and it calls its absolute value method and returns 2. This can also be seen in the string example. Ruby is automatically typed as a string, even though it's not a variable. It doesn't say string is equal to Ruby. So it calls reverse on the Ruby, and you can see the output is that Ruby is reversed. One of the great things about Ruby is that it is open sourced. This goes hand in hand with what Matz was trying to do when he created his language. He wanted it to be easy for people to use and open for people to use. One of the things that has come about because of this is that Ruby has been extended to work on very many platforms. Just about any platform you can think of, Ruby has been able to work on it. Another thing that goes hand in hand with what Matz was going for is the garbage collector. One way to make a language easier to use is to make it so that the developer does not have to worry about managing memory whenever they are programming. One of the things that Ruby does very well are regular expressions. They're basically a default in Ruby and are inspired from Perl. Regular expressions are an expression that describes a set of strings. Now, a textbook did an example of a Java program that takes a search word and a replacement word and the document that goes into it and that would run the code and replace the word with that. And it took about 50 lines of code. The Ruby version that they were able to write took about 6 lines of code. While this is only one example, it does show the fact that Ruby is very well equipped to work with regular expressions, that they were able to do a find and replace operation in 6 lines of code. One interesting characteristic of Ruby is that it is single inheritance. Now, single inheritance means that a class cannot inherit from more than one parent class or object. Now, this does kind of seem like it would limit the functionality of a class or what you could do with a class. The way that Ruby gets around this is they use something called a mix-in. Now, when you use a mix-in, you basically are going to use the keyword inherit and, you're going to use the keyword include and a module name. Now, what a module is a group of classes or just a class itself, or a group of classes and constants and stuff like that are all wrapped up inside of one namespace. So when you do the include, you just say include and the namespace name. This allows an object to be able to use the methods in that class for free as if they were an object. Ruby on Rails was created in 2003 by David Hansen. It is a web application framework that was written in Ruby. It is also called Rails. Now, Rails is what is called an opinionated language. It will generally suggest ways to write things or discourage others because it has the idea that it knows the best way to do this. That is part of this second motto down here called convention over configuration. If Ruby has a way to do something, it will tell you that's the way that you should do it. One of the ways that it implements this is that it creates what's called a skeleton code, and it will set up basically a skeleton program for you to then fill in with all of the code that you want to specific to your application. Another one of the mottos is don't repeat yourself. Don't repeat yourself is pretty literal. It just means don't write your code more than once. So Ruby has come a long way since 1995. It went from being what's known as a boutique language in Japan to one of the most used languages on GitHub. Its popularity can be attributed to three things. Its supportive community. When you have a community that's this supportive and is this much into a language, they're going to talk about it and spread it and try to get other people to use it. This is going to make it more popular. Another thing is its clean syntax. Ruby is easy to pick up on. It's easy to read and write, and it generally makes sense to the people that use it. The third thing is Ruby on Rails. It's a very common web application framework. In fact, two websites that use Ruby on Rails are GitHub and Hulu.